las tormentas agitan los aires y nubes oscuras nos impiden ver.
Greetings, brothers, sisters, friends, comrades, workers of the world, and welcome to the Black Rose. This video is going to be a response to Michael Shanklin's video Collectivism / Anarcho-Communism Planned Chaos, in which he presents his case against anarchist communism. So, with no further ado, let's get on with it.
What is anarcho-communism, and how does it contrast with anarcho-capitalism? Anarcho-communism is a theory of anarchism which advocates the abolition of the state, private property, and capitalism in favor of common ownership of the means of production, direct democracy, or a horizontal network of voluntary associations and workers' councils with production and consumption based on the guiding principle, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Which brings us to our first contradiction. Anarcho-communism is basically a voluntary government. Although anarcho-communists call for abolishing the state due to its coercive nature, they still want to keep a system that central plans.
The first supposed contradiction is not a contradiction at all. Yes, we do advocate for the distribution of goods and services based on need through direct consensus democracy, and that could be described as a form of government, but what we are against is social hierarchies in states, not governments. There's an important distinction here. A state is the monopoly on the use of violence within a specific area. It's worth mentioning that violence is not just physical force, but also other forms of oppression, such as systematic racism, sexism, transphobia, classism, ableism, ageism, etc. Basically any method by which your access to any particular thing that you need is limited or prohibited. A government is an organization which has the authority to make political decisions within a specific area. The state is one of the means by which a government can enforce its decisions, but it's of course not the only one. As a government, by the definition proposed by me, can include all members of a community, I don't see how governments are inherently oppressive or anti-anarchist. What we argue for is essentially a government that includes everyone, so that no one can be oppressed. Everyone will have an equal amount of control over the system. This of course means that we do not want a system that central plans. Central planning specifically refers to a system in which the planning is being carried out by authorities that are above the general public in a political hierarchy. We want a system that decentrally plans.
One of the largest proponents of anarcho-communism, Peter Kropotkin, argued against capitalism. This is because Kropotkin had a difficult time differentiating between capitalism and corporatism. Capitalism being defined as the lack of a public sector.
The actual definition of capitalism is a system of private ownership of the means of production, exchange of goods and services for profit in a market economy, all powered by wage labor.
And corporatism being defined as statist advantages, loopholes, lobbying, subsidies, protectionism, barriers to entry against competitors, basically any state-backed intervention that is economically advantageous for the corporate structure.
That too is false, depending on your view of things, of course. True, there are several definitions of corporatism, and that is one of them, but what you're describing is not the traditional definition. It's not the one used in most political contexts. Corporatism is actually defined as a capitalist system in which the state acts as the body of the entirety of society, uniting all economic parts into the cogs in the same machine, essentially. Corporations are an incorporated by an independent part of society, so are trade unions, etc., etc. So when disputes were to arise, like strikes for example, the unions and the corporations would sit down at some sort of council meeting, and the state would act as a mediator between the two, trying to come up with a solution that fit them both. It's a system based on the cooperation between the classes. I do, however, understand what you mean when you use the word corporatism. You mean a market in which there is state interference. Though you may be correct that there is some difference between laissez-faire capitalism and statal capitalism, I do not see how their effects, like the effects of the systems, differ. Capitalism necessarily creates an anti-democratic system where those with more capital have more power than those with less capital, and can, because of this, affect others' opportunities to gain capital, the same capital that they themselves used, or the same sort of capital. It maintains a hierarchical system. It has the same result as statist capitalism. The companies in an anarcho-capitalist society would virtually become new states, as they would have the capital and thereby the means to oppress those who tread on their property. You may say that this would violate the NAP, but who's to stop them? When in positions of power, our capacity to empathize with others becomes less prominent, and we are more likely to screw people over in order to gain more wealth. The same could be said about private courts and police services. As you used Peter Kropotkin as a segue into this topic, it is also worth mentioning that Kropotkin criticized capitalism by your definition as well. During his lifetime, capitalism generally worked under laissez-faire models.
This same corporate structure that is, of course, created, licensed, protected, and backed by the state in the first place. They fail to realize that free market businesses are viewed in the same light as an individual's home. Unlike businesses in statism that are really controlled by the centralized coercive monopoly through various regulations, and which could be confiscated legally through political whim. They also fail to realize that property rights are a natural occurrence of spontaneous order.
This is an appeal to nature, and a faulty one. Capitalism does not spontaneously appear in nature, see primitive communism, and even if it did, that wouldn't make it preferable to communism.
That if the state's monopoly on justice was abolished, and dispute resolution organizations or tiered arbitration, whatever you want to call these competing law firms, if these DROs were allowed to operate outside the government's monopoly, that they would have a direct incentive to protect private property rights. In fact, that is what every consumer is actually purchasing from them. Protection over property, both over oneself, self-ownership, and justly acquired property. Let's look at the term private property for a second. Private property is the right of persons and firms, voluntary groups of persons, to obtain, own, control, employ, dispose of, and bequeath land, capital, and other forms of property.
Yes, the DROs would have an incentive to defend property rights, but there would be a larger incentive to protect larger companies, allowing for the slow evolution of a free society into a class-based one, where those with more money, and by extension better security firms at their disposal, can oppress those with no money at all, or even just lesser amounts of money. Those with more capital have more power. How's this different from statism? Not in structurally, but in effect. How is it different? How is the oppression different? It's different only in the way that it's worse, since corporations have less accountability to the people than the state. I would also like to point out that a firm is not necessarily a voluntary group of people, as some members of the group might not have any other choice but to be part of it. That is, people who are too poor to start their own companies and can't, for whatever reasons, be hired anywhere else. We also reject self-ownership because of things like voluntary slavery, but that's better saved for a later date.
Private property is distinguished from public property, which refers to assets owned by a state, community, or government, rather than by individuals or a business entity. Private property emerged as a dominant form of property in the means of production and land during the Industrial Revolution in the early 18th century, displacing feudal property and guilds. Private property rights are the backbone of individual rights. They're simply an extension of the right to own yourself, self-ownership.
The reason that we have a problem with your ideas of private property is that it becomes too easy for feudalistic situations to arise. So if someone owns land, he or she can decide who lives upon it and what firms are allowed there, etc. And by doing so, he or she can manipulate the situation so that it maximizes his or her own monetary gain, and minimizes others. Now you could say that someone who treats people living on his or her land badly would be boycotted by most people. But the problem is that not everyone, and certainly not those living on his or her land, would have the means to do so. Moving in a capitalist society, as with anything else in a capitalist society, requires money. Money that not everyone is going to have, which inevitably results in the oppression of some. This all applies to private ownership of the means of production as well. And this is not just magically solved by the NAP, because there is literally no incentive, monetary or otherwise, to follow it. It's like putting a dog's leash on a dreadnought-class battleship. It just doesn't work. Furthermore, the NAP is already inadequate in its definition of violence, as it doesn't seem to apply to structural violence, and sometimes in fact support it. Like if you and I are stuck in a desert, and I have enough water to last both of us until we find a way out, yet choose to deny you your share of this water, you would have to forcefully take it from me in order to stay alive. And this attack on me would be a violation of the NAP. And this idea can be applied to larger societal contexts. And this structural violence is very prevalent in capitalist society.
The lack of private property rights leads to collective ownership. This means that in anarcho-communism, the system would have the right to vote away your property. If someone walked on your land, you would have no rightful means of removing them from your justly acquired property. What incentive is there for you to maintain, let alone improve the property, if it is always under the threat of siege? Unlike anarcho-communists, anarcho-capitalists view this intruder's actions as trespassing, a form of theft, as long as the property owner justly acquired the property through the peaceful and voluntary market. In other words, a mutual agreement from the previous rightful owner.
The collective isn't some mysterious ghost that will hover over you, making laws and stealing possessions. It is you and I and every other member of the community. Now, if we're working under direct consensus democracy, the community would never, in fact could never, let's say, demolish your house without your consent. Furthermore, it's important to make a distinction between private property and private possessions, or personal property. Possessions are things whose purpose is personal use, like your house, your car, your toothbrush, and these would not ever be taken from you. It is the things which you cannot justify as being for personal use, like entire acres of lands, schools, factories, etc., that would be collectivized and by extension democratized. Another reason that we reject your idea of justly acquired private property is that we believe there can be no just owner. There is no justification for the ownership of things that aren't made for personal use. But let's say you find yourself homeless in an anarcho-communist society, for whatever reason. How do you think that situation would be dealt with? Would we simply vote this homeless person away? No, since our core principle is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, as you so eloquently read off of Wikipedia earlier in your own video, we, the community, would work together and build you a house. It's a system based on egalitarianism and solidarity.
Anarcho-communists also ignore scarcity, often referring to the post-scarcity period or era in which they have the means to satisfy all wants and needs, which is simply not true.
I and many of my comrades hold to the idea that scarcity, especially scarcity of fuels and electricity, is manufactured by the capitalist class in order for profits to rise. Many studies have shown that currently we do have the technology needed to provide for the entire world's population, if we would just cooperate instead of competing. But even if we don't, I don't see how this issue is more relevant for communists than for capitalists. How is cooperation a less effective method than competition when it comes to this issue.
They also ignore spontaneous order and the individual rights that would be inherent without institutionalized violence, without the state, instead choosing collective central planning, which often always whittles down to an oligarchy.
How the fuck does decentralized planning based on direct consensus democracy result in oligarchy? That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. Now, what the fuck are you talking about? If anything ends in oligarchy, it's the plutocracy that you support. I have already explained how those with more capital have authority over those with less, because those with lots of capital are the ones that are able to change society. Because they own it. They bought it with their capital. It's an oligarchy.
The kicker? You can have anarcho-communism inside anarcho-capitalism. But you can't have anarcho-capitalism inside anarcho-communism. If the central directive views your land as valuable, and since they have no concept for the respect of justly acquired property, your property would be seized in a matter of seconds. After all, the system's property rights come before yours. Although that brings us to another contradiction, since no one is supposed to have property rights at all. In anarcho-capitalism, individuals could voluntarily create and form a collective and run it as they see fit. Anarcho-capitalists are not allotted the same respect.
Sure, you can have a communist society within anarcho-capitalism, until some rich landowner comes along with his DRO and drives you away. The NAP is not an argument, it's a naive delusion. Also, granted, of course, that you're able to acquire all the capital necessary to actually establish a communist society, which is unlikely in the extreme. Also, why should we be forced to work under your oppressive system in order to establish ours? How does any of this make any sense to you?
Most anarcho-communists are not anarcho-capitalists because they look down on private property. Anarcho-communists have an inherent belief that property rights only come from the state. They don't realize that the state has always been the greatest opponent of property rights, not a defender.
Who the fuck has ever said that property rights are bad because they come from the state? Please tell me his name and I will personally find him and hit him in the head with a brick. No, property rights aren't bad because they come from the state. They're bad because they allow for and even necessitate the oppression of the poor by the rich. If you own land and someone lives there, you can give them a condition to either work for you 10 hours per day or be kicked the fuck off. Now the worker may not be able to get off your land, as he or she might not have the monetary means to move or establish oneself as a competitor to this landowner. Power corrupts, the NAP is irrelevant, and authority ensures hierarchy. We are not just anti-statist, we're anti-hierarchy. Furthermore, most anarchist communists actually believe the opposite of your strawman. The state actually came from property rights and not the other way around. The state only came about to defend the property of the bourgeoisie from the proletarian attempts to reclaim them.
They usually view the profit incentive system as inadequate and damaging, which I don't know what they want, bosses. No, but seriously, they are central planners and want to collectively own and plan their entire economy, but without a feedback mechanism.
Actually, we do have a feedback mechanism. It's called taking inventory and discussing needs.
Voting every so often is obviously not as reliable as tracking medium of exchanges, money, through the pricing mechanism where individuals put their money where their mouth is. The nice thing about anarcho-communism is, supposedly, all of this is supposed to be voluntary. But this is simply what a business is. They simply use the pricing mechanism to measure feedback and adjust investment or withdraw investment based on these indicators. The problem is the state's intervention, its taxation theft, its destructive and politically tainted regulation that is often prescribed by the statists, corporatist lobbyists themselves. This is what rules society today. We are trapped to statism, to institutionalized coercion, and it's not voluntary. It is enslavement. Once you get rid of the collective system of institutionalized violence, the monopoly control of fiat currency would vanish.
You wouldn't vote for a representative every so often. You would actually get together and discuss what would be done, after which you would go out and do it. I've already explained why businesses aren't voluntary. The reason that private property of means of production or of land can never be justified as voluntary is that them not being owned collectively ensures oppression. This too has been explained to you. Taking inventory is a thing. I don't know what else to say. Your points are weak.
The large-scale wars would be impossible, as the statist systems and their military-industrial complexes would not be able to dump the costs not only on future generations through debt, but also through taxes and inflation in the present. No one would fuel victimless crimes, as it is a losing battle, and almost no one would write a check out of their own checkbook for thousands and thousands of dollars for impossible results. The problem is, instead of admitting the truth that central planning, especially without a money system, let alone individual rights, property rights, is an ultimate failure.
Oh yes, anarchist communist societies will crumble from within. Except no anarchist societies that have existed have ever done so. Fascinating, huh?
They create a new voluntary government which only leads to control and protection over the collective's assets. How can this collective claim to have property rights when it won't even honor the individual choices of those inside its system? What if a person doesn't want to give up the land that they put time and sweat and labor into, the land they raised their kids on?
I have already explained why private property of land is a bad thing and why personal property is a good thing. Now, even if the sort of private property of land you're currently talking about is not the same as the examples I gave earlier, it still legitimizes that. It still legitimizes all private ownership of land. Furthermore, what prohibits you from raising your children on collectively owned land? Nothing does. As you would have an equal amount of authority over the collectively owned land as anyone else. That's what collective ownership entails.
What if this family disagrees with the collective? Obviously, the collective has gotten it wrong numerous times.
The US is not run by the collective. You're claiming that the current system is democratic, which it is not. Almost the entire modern world is run through oligarchical means. Capitalist lobbies run society through quote-unquote campaign contributions and similar things. In an anarchist communist society, we would have direct consensus democracy, a system of direct consensus democracy, which would mean that you literally could not be oppressed, because your point of view would always be taken into account, and could not be discarded by some sort of political authority. You cannot disagree with the collective, because you are as much the collective as anyone else is. Any decision that the collective may make will be one that you agree with, because the system is based on consensus.
Even voluntary central planning is a failure and inefficient, and it only opens the valve to coercive central planning.
Yeah, just keep making unfounded assertions without any evidence and without presenting any arguments.
The free market is really just you, and I, and our neighbors, living in society without institutionalized violence, rules without rulers. Anarcho-communists might claim they give you the right to own yourself.
Yeah, no, we don't. We don't claim that. Self-ownership is an oppressive idea. You cannot own yourself, nor can anyone else. You are an autonomous person and cannot be owned. It legitimizes slavery, things like that. Voluntary slavery. I'll put a video on it in the description.
But they are willing to gang up on you and take back the collective's property. At least an individualist who defends his justly acquired property has a valid claim.
That's not an argument. You have to explain why his claim is legitimate, why his claim is valid. You can't just say that it is valid. You have to explain why. This is not how discussion works. You don't just spurt out your opinions. You give some evidence. You give some argument to support them. That is how discussion works.
But why should 30 men get to tyrannize another peaceful individual? Just because the other 30 people said so?
Private ownership over the means of production is an inherently violent position. Perhaps not direct physical force, but it is a form of systemic violence, which means that the individual is not in fact peaceful, and the expropriation of the means of production is justified as self-defense.
Very few people would ever enter into anarcho-communist arrangements because it is predestined to fail, as the individuals in the group would inevitably seek their own goals versus the goals of the centrally planned collective.
Firstly, as I've said, anarchist communism is not centrally planned, it is decentrally planned. Secondly, an anarcho-communist society based on direct consensus democracy would take your personal goals into account. The collective goals would be the same as your personal ones, because it's a system of consensus democracy. If things are better for the collective, things are by definition better for you. That's how our system is structured.
The hypocrisy that the collective can own property, but that the individual can't.
How is it hypocritical to think that things that concern all of us ought to be controlled by all of us on an egalitarian basis? It's not two contradictory positions, it's one consistent position.
The fact that they ignore division of labor and scarcity. The fact that they would abolish all currency, even voluntary currency, which is really just a peaceful medium of exchange for feedback mechanisms.
This is a misconception. We wouldn't abolish currency by like banning it or something like that. We'd abolish currency by eliminating the need for currency. So you could still have currency, but you just wouldn't have any need to use it. If things are distributed to you for free, what need is there for a monetary system? What need is there for currency, voluntary or not?
The fact that they view you as just some serf to the collective.
For fuck's sake. We are the collective. You and I are the collective. Everyone around us in our community is the collective. There is no one who works under the collective because they would be a part of the collective. You have as much control over the society as anyone else because the system of democracy is based upon consensus. And you have common ownership of the means of production. You decide together what to do with them, who does what work, and when and how, and for what purposes. This is a democratic system. This is a system of democratic consensus. Capitalism, however. Capitalism is based on one class of people constantly cowering under another. A capitalist system implies the total subordination of the proletariat to the bourgeoisie. So I think there's some projecting going on here.
Indicates that anarcho-communists haven't come far enough in their moral compass, and that they have repeatedly ignored history.
Oh, we have ignored history. You do know that the countries that had the principles of the free market forced upon them in the beginning of the 1800s are today's third world, while countries that utterly ignored these principles are today's ruling fucking powers, right? You do know that revolutionary Catalonia existed and worked for several years, right? You have heard of anarchist Ukraine, right? No, of course you haven't, and I didn't expect you to. But I assume you're talking about the Marxist-Leninist states. Interestingly, these states have actively worked against and suppressed anarchist movements.
Philosophically, anarcho-communism is an all-out assault on individuality and on rationality.
Read Oscar Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism. He's pretty annoying with his slightly elitist ways, but he does address the thing you just brought up about individualism.
The individual's desire to better him or herself, to avoid the tragedy of the commons.
The tragedy of the commons has been disproven by a Nobel Prize-winning economist. I'll put a link in the description.
To partake in the voluntary pricing system, to specialize, to advance, to grow. All of these viewed negatively in the communes of anarcho-communism.
No, the entire socialist movement has largely been a movement to help people develop their own personalities. Again, read Oscar Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism. He does address this.
You are looked down upon for growing and learning and working faster and harder than your peers. It actually stunts human development.
No, even in communist society you can work however much you want and you'll still be rewarded what you need or what you want. That is the principle under which we work, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Furthermore, I think it's kind of amazing that you think the elimination of economic barriers and psychologically destructive systems would stunt human development.
Whether anarcho-communism is voluntary-based or coercive-backed, the hatred for the individual is ever prevalent.
We've been over this. Get to your next point already.
Where is the limit? Does this collective get to vote on my marriage?
Oh my fucking god, this is so stupid.
That is not freedom nor voluntarism.
Dude, are you for real? Are you an actual ANCAP? Because I cannot believe that you would be this stupid.
Unless I subscribe to these terms in the first place. But don't expect me to subscribe to this rabid hatred of the individual called anarcho-communism anytime soon. Although you are certainly free to enjoy this inefficient central planning masochism as much as you'd like. I certainly won't infringe on you. I just ask you grant everyone else, including me, the same respect.
Can you feel euphoria tonight? Not from those phony things. Enlightened by my high intelligence.